The studio lights burned bright as the countdown clock ticked towards 0. Behind the polished desk of Good Morning America, everything looked calm, controlled, and professional, but beneath the surface. Tension was already building. Dave Chappelle sat relaxed in his chair, leaning slightly back, his fingers loosely interlocked as if he had all the time in the world. Across from him, George Stephanopoulos shuffled his notes, glancing up every few seconds with a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The segment had been teased all morning as a must-watch conversation. Viewers expected humor, maybe a few sharp remarks, but no one anticipated what was about to unfold. "Welcome back," George began smoothly, turning toward Dave with a practiced ease. "We're here with comedian Dave Chappelle, whose latest special has sparked quite a conversation." Dave nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. That's one way to put it. George leaned forward, his tone sharpening just a touch. "Some critics say your recent material crosses lines around culture, identity, and responsibility. Do you think you've gone too far this time?" A brief silence followed. Dave tilted his head, studying George like a chess player evaluating the next move. Then he smiled, not a wide grin, but something quieter, more deliberate. "Too far for who?" he asked calmly. The question hung in the air. George shifted slightly, clearly expecting a more defensive answer. "Well, for audiences who feel targeted or misrepresented." Dave leaned forward now, matching George's posture. "You mean audiences who don't like being joked about?" George tried to maintain control. "It's not just about jokes, it's about impact." Dave's smile faded just enough to reveal something sharper underneath. "Impact is interesting, because every time I speak, suddenly we're talking about impact. But when people talk about me, really talk about me, it's just commentary, right?" The crew behind the cameras exchanged glances. Something was shifting. This wasn't going according to the usual script. George cleared his throat. "We're just asking questions that reflect public concern." Dave nodded slowly. "No, you're framing the narrative. There's a difference." George paused, clearly taken aback by the directness. "I think it's fair to say journalists have a role in asking tough questions." Dave chuckled softly. "Tough questions? Or convenient ones?" The atmosphere in the studio tightened. Even the audience seemed quieter now, sensing that this was no longer a typical morning show exchange. George pressed on, his voice firmer. "Do you feel any responsibility for how your words affect people?" Dave didn't hesitate this time. "Of course I do. But responsibility doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean I stop telling the truth as I see it just because it makes someone uncomfortable." George quickly interjected, "But isn't there a line between truth and offense?" Dave's eyes locked onto his. "Only if you let other people draw that line for you." There was a flicker of tension, subtle but unmistakable. George leaned back slightly, regrouping. "Some would argue that comedians today need to evolve with the times." Dave nodded again. "I agree, but evolving doesn't mean conforming. It means understanding the world. Better, not pretending. It's something it's not." George opened his mouth to respond, but Dave continued, his voice steady and controlled. "You know what's interesting, George? People always want comedians to stay in their lane. Just make us laugh, they say. But the moment we say something real, something that makes people think, it becomes a problem." The room was silent now. The usual background noise of morning television had completely faded. George attempted to steer the conversation back. "But there's a difference between making people think and provoking controversy." Dave shrugged lightly. "Controversy is just a word people use when they don't want to engage with what's being said." A producer off camera made a small hand gesture, signaling for George to wrap things up, but George wasn't ready to let go. "Let me ask you this," he said, leaning in again. "Do you think your platform gives you too much influence?" Dave laughed, a genuine laugh this time. "Too much influence? That's funny. Because last I checked, people choose what they watch. They choose what they listen to." He paused, then added, "If I have influence, it's because people are willing to hear me. That's not something you can fake." George hesitated, clearly running out of prepared angles. Some would still say that with influence comes accountability. Dave's expression turned serious again. "Accountability goes both ways. If you're going to question me, you should also question the systems that decide which voices get amplified and which ones get criticized." That line landed hard. Even George seemed momentarily unsure how to respond. The silence stretched just a second too long. Then Dave leaned back again, returning to that relaxed posture he had started with. Look, I'm not here to win an argument. I'm here to have a conversation. But a real one. Not one where the conclusion is already decided before I even speak. George exhaled slowly, forcing a smile. Well, we certainly appreciate your honesty. Dave nodded. I appreciate the opportunity, just wish it felt a little more like a dialogue. The tension didn't fully break, but something shifted. The edge had softened, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of what had just happened. A producer's voice echoed faintly from off-camera. 30 seconds. George turned back to the camera, slipping back into his anchor persona. Dave Chappelle, everyone. His latest special is streaming now. We'll be right back. The red light on the camera dimmed. The segment was over, but the atmosphere lingered. Dave stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket. He gave George a brief nod, not hostile, not friendly, just final. As he walked off the set, a few crew members exchanged looks. No one said it out loud, but they were all thinking the same thing. That wasn't just an interview, that was something else entirely. And by the time the clip hit social media later that day, it would be clear to everyone watching, Dave Chappelle hadn't just answered questions. He had completely flipped the conversation.